안녕하십니까. 헤럴드 기업 포럼 2020의 진행을 맡은 헤럴드 경제 산업부 정세희 기자입니다. 오늘 포럼의 주제는 새로운 시대 기업의 도전, Navigating a New Era입니다. 신종 코로나 바이러스 확산으로 위기를 겪고 있는 기업의 활로를 모색하고 미래를 전망하고자 합니다. 코로나19로 국경 간 이동이 쉽지 않은 상황을 감안해 미국, 독일, 프랑스, 싱가포르 등 세계 각지의 유명한 인사들은 온라인으로 오늘 포럼에 참여합니다. 여러분은 이곳에서 대형 화면으로 연사들이 실시간으로 강연하고 토론하는 모습을 보시게 될 겁니다. 모든 외국 연사의 강연은 동시 통역되고 테이블 위에 놓여진 통역기를 사용해서 들을 수 있습니다. 통역기 1번 채널은 한국어, 2번은 영어로 청취 가능합니다. 오늘 이 자리를 위해 특별한 분들께서 참석해 주셨습니다. 지금부터 호명하는 분들께 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 성윤모 산업통상자원부 장관님입니다. 이하경 더불어민주당 국회의원이십니다. 권충원 헤럴드 대표이사 사장이십니다. 우태희 대한상공회의소 부회장님입니다. 권태신 전국경제인연합회 부회장님입니다. 한진현 한국무역협회 부회장님입니다. 제임스 김 주한미국 상공회의소 회장님입니다. 이재훈 김앤장 법률사무소 상임 고문님입니다. 김영률 한국바스프 대표이사 회장님입니다. 이규철 법무법인 대륙아주 대표 변호사입니다. 이동근 현대경제연구원장이십니다. 그럼 헤럴드 기업 포럼 2020의 개회식을 진행하겠습니다. 먼저 권충원 헤럴드 대표님의 개회사가 있겠습니다. 큰 박수로 맞이해 주시기 바랍니다.
안녕하십니까. 코로나 전국 속에서 많이 몸을 살릴 수밖에 없는 상황에서 여기에 와주신 내외 기분 여러분께 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 사실 코로나19에서 가장 바쁘신 장관님이 성윤모 산업통상자원부 장관이신데 참석해 주셔서 고맙고요. 요즘 시대에서는 뭐니 해도 국회입니다. 담당 상임위 이하경 위원장님 오셔서 감사합니다. 사실 코로나19가 우리에게 너무 많은 변화를 줬습니다. 상당히 어렵게 만든 측면도 있고 새로운 희망을 불어넣은 측면도 있을 겁니다. 여기서 살아남느냐 죽느냐는 어떻게 대처하느냐에 달려 있다고 봅니다. 위기는 기회도 불러오고 더 나은 성장을 가져온다는 것을 역사는 보여줬습니다. 좀 이따 기조연설 제이스 퍼먼 하버드대 교수는 오바마 정권에서 경제자문회 의장을 거쳤던 석학이십니다. 코로나 이후에 전 세계는 어디로 가는지, 대한민국의 좌표는 어디에 있는지, 우리는 여기서 어떤 진로를 택해야 되는지 이런 거시적 큰 측면에서 석학들 모시고 얘기를 듣고요. 큰 흐름이 있다 하더라도 하나의 업종 또 기업은 달라져야 됩니다. 여행업처럼 위기에 처한 업종이 있지만 거기도 대처를 잘하면 살아남을 수 있을 겁니다. 오히려 이번 기회에 구조조정과 새로운 비즈니스 영역을 창출할 수 있다고 보고요. 우리가 그렇게 노래 불렀던 4차 산업 적어도 3년 이상은 앞당겨지고 오고 있는 것 같습니다. 오늘 이 자리에 이것이 모두 전 세계로 나갑니다. 그리고 해외 석학들이 발표를 하시고 그 다음에 토론까지 할 수 있는 시대에 우리는 살고 있습니다. 많은 변화가 있을 것입니다. 우리 헤럴드 경제 신문은 기업하신 여러분들 곁에 항상 있을 겁니다. 같이 호흡하고 같이 고민하고 대한민국이 어디로 갈 건지 우리 기업이 어떻게 갈 건지 거기서 공감대를 형성하고 새로운 해법을 찾아 나가겠습니다. 오늘 이 자리에서 좋은 얘기 많이 듣고 기업들한테 많은 도움이 됐으면 하고요. 다시 한번 이 자리에 오신 여러분들께 진심으로 감사드립니다.
권충원 헤럴드 대표님께 정말 감사드립니다. 이어서 정세균 국무총리님의 축하 영상 메시지가 있겠습니다.
존경하는 내외 귀빈 여러분 반갑습니다. 헤럴드 기업 포럼 2020 개최를 축하드립니다. 권충원 헤럴드 경제 대표이사 사장님과 임직원 여러분, 온 오프라인으로 준비하시느라 수고 많이 하셨습니다. 올해 포럼 주제는 새로운 시대 기업의 도전입니다. 포스트 코로나 시대를 맞아 위기와 불확실성을 넘어 새로운 비즈니스 전략을 구상하는 자리입니다. 코로나19로 이곳 서울에서 미국, 독일, 프랑스, 싱가포르 4개국 연사 여러분들과 화상으로 함께 하지만 한 분 한 분의 귀중한 강연에서 오늘의 위기를 헤쳐나갈 지혜를 얻으실 수 있으리라 생각합니다. 존경하는 국민 여러분, 내외 귀빈 여러분, 지금 세계는 팬데믹에 경제 불황, 기후의 역습까지 동시다발로 출현한 대형 악재와 씨름하고 있습니다. 많은 기업이 성장 이전에 생존을 고민해야 하는 그야말로 절체절명의 위기와 마주하고 있습니다. 변화된 환경을 헤쳐나가기 위한 더 유연하고 더 민첩한 대응은 선택이 아닌 필수가 되고 있습니다. 이 자리를 빌려 전례 없는 위기와 고난을 헤쳐나가고 계신 모든 기업인 여러분께 진심 어린 위로와 응원을 보냅니다. 감사드릴 일도 있습니다. 먼저 코로나19 위기에도 불구하고 노사가 힘을 합쳐 흑자를 이어가고 계신 기업인 여러분, 감사합니다. 코로나19 여파로 영업이익이 급감한 가운데서도 투자를 늘려주신 기업인 여러분, 고맙습니다. 여러분의 저력이 미래 대한민국을 글로벌 선도국가로 우뚝 서게 할 것입니다. 정부도 구체적인 실천으로 응답하고 있습니다. 얼마 전 새로운 국가 발전 전략인 한국판 뉴딜 정책을 발표하고 디지털 경제와 그린 경제로의 전환에 속도를 내고 있습니다. 전략의 중심에는 안전망 확충과 사람 중심 경제를 두었습니다. 코로나19의 위기는 역설적으로 우리 모두가 연결되어 있다는 소중한 진리를 일깨워 주었습니다. 이제 연대와 상생은 시대적 과제입니다. 저는 연대와 상생의 미래 가치를 깨닫는 기업이 더 큰 가능성의 문을 열 것이라고 믿습니다. 오늘 크리스티안 헬러 바스프 부사장께서 코로나19 위기와 따뜻한 자본주의를 주제로 특별 강연을 해주실 텐데 연대와 상생을 위한 구체적인 통찰을 얻을 수 있을 것으로 기대합니다. 다시 한번 오늘 헤럴드 기업 포럼 2020 개최를 축하드리며 함께하신 모든 분들의 건승을 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
축하 영상 메시지를 보내주신 국무총리님께 감사드립니다. 이어서 성윤무 산업통상자원부 장관님의 축사가 있겠습니다. 큰 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
네, 안녕하십니까. 먼저 헤럴드 기업 포럼 2020의 개최를 축하드리겠습니다. 뜻깊은 자리를 마련한 우리 헤럴드 권충원 대표이사님과 기업인들께 감사와 경의의 말씀을 드립니다. 이하경 산업통상 중소벤처기업연회 위원장님, 또 대한상의 무역협회 등 경제담배 대표, 또 제이슨 퍼먼 교수님, 토마 필로폰 교수님 등 국내 여러분들께도 함께 인사를 드립니다. 오늘 포럼의 주제는 새로운 시대 기업의 도전입니다. 코로나는 우리의 삶과 일상을 바꾸어 놓았고 특히 세 가지 측면에서 코로나 시대는 이전과 다른 특성이 있다고 보여집니다. 우선 코로나는 전례가 없는 우리가 경험하지 못한 상황을 만들고 있습니다. 전 세계적으로 경제 활동이 제약되면서 대공황 이후 처음일 정도로 마이너스 성장과 교육 축소가 세계 경제를 짓누르고 있습니다. 공급망 교란이라는 새로운 리스크도 관리해야 할 것입니다. 두 번째 특징은 불확실성입니다. 안전하고 효과적인 백신만이 현 상황을 종결시키고 모든 활동을 이전으로 돌려놓을 수 있을 것입니다. 그 전까지 코로나의 종료 시점은 예단하기가 힘듭니다. 세 번째 특징은 비대면이라고 생각합니다. 거리두기를 하면서 또 음식 배달은 물론 공영 관람 그리고 화상 회의까지 다양하고 새로운 온라인 세상을 경험 중에 있습니다. 코로나는 인류 역사에 기록될 새로운 또 문명사적 변화를 가져오고 있습니다. 기업들도 현재의 상황과 도전을 면밀히 진단하고 또 위기를 기회로 만드는 발상의 전환이 필요하다고 생각합니다. 세계 경제가 봉쇄되면서 수요 절벽이 지속되었고 또 불확실성으로 인해 기업 투자는 위축되었습니다. 자유무역의 퇴조, 또 글로벌 공급망의 재편, 건강과 환경에 대한 높은 관심 등 과거에 경험하지 못했던 도전들이 산적해 오고 있습니다. 위기라는 말이 기회를 동시에 의미하듯이 코로나 충격 속에도 도약할 기회를 찾을 수 있을 것입니다. 우선 비대면 활동이 만들어낸 새로운 시장을 저희가 주목할 필요가 있다고 생각을 합니다. 그리고 두 번째는 또 코로나로 가속화된 디지털 경제의 전환은 연관 산업의 성장도 함께 이끌어내고 있습니다. 그리고 세 번째는 건강의 중요성과 또 환경의 가치를 체감하면서 방역과 바이오 산업은 물론 새로운 친환경 시장도 함께 커가고 있습니다. 그간 정부는 8차례의 비상경제 대책회의를 통해서 중소기업과 소상공인 또 피해 업종 지원을 위한 총 277조 원 규모의 대책을 마련해서 방역과 함께 민생 안정, 경기 회복을 위해 최선을 다해 왔습니다. 또한 수출 반등을 위해서 316조 원 규모의 무역금융과 공급과 또 비대면 마케팅 활동 등을 지원해 왔고 자동차, 조선 등 업종별 맞춤형 대책도 수립한 바가 있습니다. 앞으로도 정부는 우리 기업의 편에서 기업이 코로나 시대를 극복하고 또 기회로 활용할 수 있도록 최선을 다하고자 합니다. 우선 정부는 방역 없이는 경제도 없다는 인식하에 산업 현장 방역 강화를 최우선적으로 추진해 나가겠습니다. 방역과 경제는 반드시 함께 잡아야 할 두 마리의 토끼입니다. 방역에 총력을 다해 코로나 상황을 관리하고 안정시켜야 경기 반등의 골든타임을 놓치지 않을 수 있습니다. 앞으로도 산업 현장의 정상 가동을 위해서 선제적이고도 또 강도 높은 방역 체계를 갖추어 나가겠습니다. 두 번째로는 우리 기업이 위기를 신속하게 극복할 수 있도록 필요한 지원을 적기에 공급하겠습니다. 우선 이를 위해서 국내 수요를 견인해 나가겠습니다. 4분기 예정된 산업부의 공공기관에 4.3조 원의 투자를 조기 집행하고 또 내년 투자 계획 중 일부도 금년으로 앞당겨 집행하겠습니다. 코리아 셀 페스타와 같은 내수 진작 행사도 충실히 적실히 준비하겠습니다. 그리고 취약계층과 또 피해 업종에 대한 금융과 고용 지원도 계속해 나가겠습니다. 보다 많은 중소 중견기업 협력업체가 기간산업안정기금의 혜택을 받도록 노력하겠습니다. 또한 기업 지원과 고용 안정을 위해서 4차례의 추경을 통해 준비한 예산과 사업도 신속히 집행하겠습니다. 이와 함께 무역 금융과 수출 마케팅을 강화해서 수출 기반도 함께 지켜 나가겠습니다. 중견기업의 수출 신용 보증 한도를 2배로 확대하고 또 온라인 보증 프로그램을 출시해서 수출 기업의 또 부담도 덜어가겠습니다. 그리고 섬유전자 등 10대 업종별 온라인 전시관도 개관해서 실시간 상담, 또 계약부터 배송까지 가능한 시스템을 만들어 나가겠습니다. 위기 업종에 대한 맞춤형 지원책도 필요하다고 생각을 합니다. 특히 제조업의 근간인 뿌리 산업에 대해서는 이행 보증 한도를 3배로 확대해서 유동성을 보강하고 또 명장 교육센터를 운영해서 인력난 해소에 그를 지원토록 하겠습니다. 어제 참가했습니다만은 발표를 드렸습니다만 투자가 위축되어서 우리 어려움을 겪고 있는 기계 산업은 최근 신설한 3천억 규모의 금융 지원 프로그램을 통해서 우리 중소 중견기업에 대한 자금 공급도 함께 늘려가겠습니다. 세 번째로는 우리 기업들이 코로나 충격에도 미래의 기회를 포착하고 또 미래를 준비해 나갈 수 있도록 도우겠습니다. 한국판 뉴딜과 빅3 등 신산업 육성을 통해서 기업의 미래 사업 투자를 지원토록 하겠습니다. 디지털과 그린 뉴딜을 양대 축으로 해서 동부 투자를 속도감 있게 집행해서 우리 기업이 디지털과 친환경 전환을 새로운 성장 동력으로 만들 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 아울러서 시스템 반도체, 또 미래차, 바이오 등 빅3 산업은 기술 개발, 제도 정비를 통해서 우리나라의 제2의 또 제3의 반도체 산업으로 육성해 나가도록 하겠습니다. 산업 생태계 차원의 사업 재편도 적극 지원해서 산업 구조 변화를 선제적으로 준비토록 하겠습니다. 사업 재편은 기업의 장기 지속 가능한 성장은 물론 또 산업 생태계 경쟁력 강화를 위해서도 필수적인 과제입니다. 새로운 사업 진출과 사업화 성공을 위한 금융 지원과 기술 지원은 물론 또 산업 생태계가 함께 사업 재편을 추진할 수 있도록 필요한 지원을 만들어내 나가도록 하겠습니다. 이와 함께 특히 산업의 허리인 소재 부품 장비의 경쟁력 강화 정책도 차질 없이 추진해 나가서 현재 재편하고 있는 글로벌 공급망 재편에 대비토록 하겠습니다. 수요기업과 공급기업이 협력해서 핵심 기술을 확보하고 또 국내 소재 부품 장비의 활용을 확대해서 시험과 인증 또 판로 확보, 규제 완화 지원을 해 나가도록 하겠습니다. 소재 부품 장비 생태계 육성을 위한 특화단지 조성도 차질 없이 추진하겠습니다. 국내 수요기업과 연계되는 해외 첨단 기업의 유치를 위해서 첨단 투자기구 지정 등 정부의 투자 유치 역량을 집중토록 하겠습니다. 기업인 여러분, 올해 대한민국의 경제는 선진국 클럽인 OECD 국가 중에서 가장 양호한 성적을 거둘 것으로 현재 기대되고 있습니다. 해외에서도 우리 경제의 역동성과 회복력에 대한 평가가 이루어지고 있습니다. 그렇지만 우리 경제의 힘은 바로 우리 기업에서 나온다고 생각합니다. 기업인 여러분들이 있었기에 우리 경제가 지금까지 올 수 있었습니다. 앞으로도 우리 기업의 노력과 또 축적된 역량이 위기를 극복하고 또 새로운 시대를 준비하는 토대가 될 것입니다. 정부는 기업이 그 역량을 발휘할 수 있도록 최선을 다해 지원토록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
성윤모 산업통상자원부 장관님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 좋은 말씀 감사합니다. 다음은 더불어민주당 이하경 국회의원님의 축사가 있겠습니다. 뜨거운 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
네, 여러분 이 자리에서 뵙게 돼서 반갑습니다. 국회 산업통상자원 중소벤처기업위원회 위원장 이하경입니다. 헤럴드 기업 포럼 2020 개최를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 포스트 코로나 시대 기업의 과제를 짚어보고 활로를 모색하기 위해 뜻깊은 자리를 마련해 주신 헤럴드 포럼에 감사드립니다. 그리고 고견을 들려주실 전문가 여러분, 온라인으로 국내에서 함께해 주시는 모든 분들께 감사와 환영의 인사를 드립니다. 우리 사회는 코로나19 위기를 겪으며 급격한 변화를 맞고 있습니다. 온라인 쇼핑몰과 배송 플랫폼, 넷플릭스, 카카오 등 IT 기반의 기업은 뜻밖의 특수를 누리고 있지만 전통적인 제조업, 서비스 등 기존 산업과 여행, 운송, 공연업계는 최악의 위기를 근근히 버텨내고 있는 상황입니다. 이처럼 포스트 코로나 시대의 산업 환경은 이전과는 확연히 달라지고 있습니다. 변화에 맞추어 기업의 체질을 개선하고 경쟁력을 강화하기 위해서는 오늘 포럼과 같은 정보 공유의 장이 매우 중요한 역할을 하게 될 것입니다. 아무도 경험해 본 적이 없는 전대미문의 상황 속에서 실패를 최소화하고 경쟁력을 강화하기 위해서는 다양한 업계의 정보 공유의 협력이 최선의 방책이기 때문입니다. 정부와 국회도 좀 더 적극적인 역할을 하도록 해야 합니다. 기업에 대한 행정적, 제도적 지원에서 한 걸음 더 나아가 디지털 전환을 독려하고 대중소기업 간, 기업과 소비자 간 정보 격차를 최소화하는 것이 산업 지원의 중요한 부분이 될 것입니다. 위기를 극복하고 기회로 성장해 나가기 위해서는 정부와 국회도 학습해야 된다고 생각합니다. 기업과 개인의 도전이 실패로 끝나지 않도록 국회 산자중기위원회도 현장의 목소리에 귀 기울이며 보다 선제적인 산업 지원 방안을 마련할 수 있도록 최선을 다하겠습니다. 코로나19 사태가 우리에게 주는 시대적 화두는 더불어 다 함께라고 생각합니다. 오늘 헤럴드 기업 포럼이 위기 상황에서 더불어 다 함께 잘 살기 위한 대화의 초석이 될 수 있기를 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
좋은 말씀해 주신 이하경 의원님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 이제 본격적인 포럼을 시작하겠습니다. 포럼은 제1부, 제2부, 특별 강연, 제3부로 진행됩니다. 제1부 기조연설자는 미국 버락 오바마 정부에서 경제자문위원회 의장으로 활동했던 제임스 포먼 하버드대학교 경제학과 교수입니다. 포먼 교수는 코로나19 위기 극복 처방책으로 기업에 대한 정부의 과감한 지원을 제안합니다. 그럼 보스턴을 연결하겠습니다. Hi, Professor Foreman. How are you?
Hello. I'm very good, and I'm glad to be joining you this morning, I guess it is, in Seoul.
Thank you. We are very honored to have you as our keynote speaker at the Herald Business Forum 2020. On behalf of our company, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude. Would you please give us a speech for 40 minutes from 8 to 8:40 p.m. Eastern Time?
Great, I would love to. I very much wish I could have been in Seoul with you this morning. I think if every country in the world had responded to coronavirus as well as Korea has responded, then I probably could have gotten on an airplane, come there, and been with you in person. Because as much as it's amazing the way we can all connect over video, the way I can teach my students from home, the way I can stay in touch with friends, none of it is a substitute for the in-person interactions, which have been so critical to our economies and our societies for thousands and thousands of years. Today, I want to talk about 6 challenges that we're wrestling with in the economy and what government and businesses can do in responding to these challenges. The first challenge that I'll talk about is COVID-19. If I were giving this talk 9 months ago, I obviously would not have talked about COVID-19. I would have started with the slowdown in productivity growth, inequality, the future of work, declining competition, a topic I think Tomas Philippon will probably be talking to you about as well, and declining interest rates. But given where we are now, we need to start by understanding COVID-19. And one of the concerns about COVID-19 is that it will potentially make all of these other challenges even worse. and even more serious. So that's where I'll begin my discussion. We're all familiar with the impact that COVID-19 is having on global growth. The growth rate for the world economy is expected to be 8 percentage points lower as a result of the pandemic. A couple months ago, experts thought that emerging and developing economies would be the most affected by the pandemic. In March, we saw a huge flight of capital out of the emerging markets. But since March, capital has flown back into the emerging markets. And what we've seen is that emerging and developing countries are younger, they're less obese, they're less tied into global travel. And as a result, while there's considerable variation, on average, they've been a little bit less affected by COVID. The biggest effect of COVID looks set to be on the advanced economies, on countries like the United States, on countries like Korea. Of course, there's an enormous amount of variation even within the advanced economies. This shows us growth rates in the first half of the year. So it gives us the growth rate through the second quarter of this year. You see the worst affected was the United Kingdom and France. The least affected was Australia and Korea. The United States, the United Kingdom and France had huge outbreaks of COVID, as did Italy. They had major lockdowns in their economy, and as a result, they dramatically reduced economic activity. Korea did a much better job through testing and contact tracing of containing the virus with less damage to the economy. The United States is an interesting case. Its economy performed better than most of the other European countries and Canada. The reason was, though, that the United States had less of a lockdown, and so we now have more cases of COVID than any of the other countries shown here, except for France, and as a result have more economic challenges in the second half of the year than countries like Germany that made a bigger investment earlier on in controlling the virus, hurting their growth up front, but putting them in a better position for later on. You see a similar story with variations in labor markets. This shows the unemployment rate, and the unemployment rate rose a lot in the United States. Korea is actually lucky to have had the unemployment rate fall by a small amount. The unemployment rate is a little bit misleading as an indicator because in the United States, if you furlough a worker, so they're still employed, they're just not getting any pay from their employer, they count as unemployed. In most of the other countries here, that same worker would be counted in the statistics as employed. If you adjust the United States number, the United States looks a little bit more like other countries in the world in terms of its employment experience. The COVID shock is the worst economic crisis to hit the global economy, perhaps ever. It's affected every country. It's been a large reduction in economic activity and an immediate one. At the same time, the policy response to the COVID crisis has been larger than the policy response to any previous economic crisis. Economic stimulus in terms of tax cuts and especially government transfers and spending has been larger than we've ever seen before in response to an economic crisis. Many countries have spent more than 10% of GDP on fiscal stimulus. Historically, even 2 or 3% on fiscal stimulus would be considered very large. Monetary authorities have cut interest rates to zero and expanded their balance sheets more quickly than they ever have before, rolling out a very wide array of novel, unconventional lending programs. As a result of this economic policy response, you see something amazing. I'm going to show you the United States, but you see a similar story elsewhere. This picture is what happened to GDP. In the United States, GDP went down a little bit in the first quarter. GDP went down a lot in the second quarter. But now let's look at the income of households. This is what American households had as their income. Household income rose a little bit in the second quarter, and first quarter, and it rose by a record amount in the second quarter. Why was that? That's because the government gave money to households. The government gave unemployment insurance, the government gave checks, and the government delivered money through a business lending program that effectively required you to pay wages or incentivized you to pay wages to your workers. So as a result of all these government programs, we protected people on average from the recession. Their incomes went up. In fact, if you break it down, incomes went up more for low-income households than for high-income households. These types of programs were deployed in countries around the world. You saw it in rich countries like the United States. You also saw it in poorer countries like Nigeria. In fact, the majority of countries in the world adopted some type of expanded cash transfers. And as a result, we have to some degree protected people. Now in the United States, all of this expired at the end of July. And so this is going to look worse in the third quarter of this year, at least disposable income. As a result of this unprecedented policy response, we've seen something remarkable. This shows us what's happened to retail sales in the United States, the money you spend at stores and the money you spend in restaurants. It's a V-shaped recovery. It looks exactly like a V. Compare that to the experience in the global financial crisis a decade ago. In the global financial crisis a decade ago, it fell and continued falling. So what we have in big picture terms is a massive economic shock, a massive policy response. The policy response has not prevented a recession. Unemployment rates are still up everywhere, except Korea, and then in part because of measurement issues, France. But that recession is less bad than it would have been. Let's now look forward. The easy part of the recovery has already happened. Those are workers who went back to their old jobs, businesses that were shut down and reopened. Going forward, it's going to be harder. The reason it's going to be harder is because what we're seeing is a combination. In part, households lose their jobs, have lower demand. We can solve that by giving them money. In part, though, supply. We can't make things that we used to make. We can't make a restaurant that's filled with people. We can't make a baseball stadium that's filled with fans. We can't make an airplane flight that's as safe as it was a year ago. That we don't have an economic policy for. A vaccine can help, but we don't have it. Nothing a central bank can do can solve that. To some degree, we have a liquidity shock, businesses who are temporarily out of money. But we also have a solvency shock, a business that is permanently, in effect, out of money. Its debts exceed its assets. Bankruptcy can help in that situation, but the bankruptcy system is better in the United States than it is in many countries, but everywhere it has a hard time handling a lot of bankruptcies at once and doing it in a way that doesn't destroy value. Finally, we have a stop-start shock. This is like what happens after a hurricane. A hurricane closes your businesses. When the hurricane passes, the businesses reopen. It's very easy. We know how to get through that. That's part of what's happened. The other part, though, is a reallocation shock. That's much harder. A restaurant goes out of business. Its workers need to find a new job. The travel industry shrinks. People from the travel industry need to go find jobs in other industries. New businesses need to start. It's easier for a business to close than a new one to start. All of these supply shocks, reallocation, and solvency shocks will continue to affect the economy and hurt the economy long after a vaccine is in place, long after the initial recession is gone. And so I worry we're going to continue to have lingering effects from the virus, changes in our economy, but also changes that will take a while to recover from. I think this problem, this COVID crisis, will also have an effect on the next 5 challenges I'm going to talk about. I'll start with the one I think is almost the most serious: slowing productivity growth. Now, this topic comes as a surprise to some people, especially in the business community. If you read the newspaper, it's filled with incredibly optimistic stories. New breakthrough technologies, new medical innovations, Elon Musk inventing things, Apple changing iPhones, 8K resolution, AI breakthroughs. Every day we read about really amazing things happening in technology. But if you go to an economics conference, you talk to economists, you hear a much more pessimistic story. You hear about the Great American Slowdown. You hear about slow growth. You hear about growth potential dimmed. Is slow the new normal? Falling speed limit. Slowing of potential growth. How do we square these two? And who's right? The data is clearly on the side of the more pessimistic story. This shows labor productivity growth in the G7 economies, and everywhere growth slowed from, in this case, I'm showing you 1998 to 2008 compared to the decade after. So the pace of innovation was not happening as quickly. It used to happen at about 2% a year, now about 1% a year. That's a big difference. In one case, it means your productivity doubles every 35 years, and the other doubles every 70 years. It's not just the advanced economies, most of the emerging economies saw slow productivity growth. China, the largest economy in the world, has been wrestling with it. Turkey, Russia, Argentina, Brazil. A bright spot has been India, which has had some of the most impressive growth in recent years, maybe getting a passing of the torch from China. How do we square these? We see all the headlines about the tremendous innovation, but we see the economic data that shows us we don't have faster productivity growth. The way to square that is that it takes more impressive innovation than it took in the past, even to continue to make progress the same rate that we've made it in the past. Let's look at integrated circuit chips, a product that Korea has played a key role in producing and selling around the world. This is Moore's law, saying that the CPU, number of transistors in the CPU, doubles every 2 years. We have continued to keep up with Moore's law. We've continued to double every 2 years. But it's getting harder and harder to do this. The number of researchers engaged in semiconductors has increased by a factor of 20. Increased by a factor of 20 in the last 45 years. And so it takes more and more effort, more and more impressive artificial intelligence, more and more impressive gene editing, more and more impressive supercomputers to continue to make progress on agricultural yields, cancer mortality rates, manufacturing production, and the like. And moreover, we're making very little progress in large other sectors of the economy dominated by in-person services like education and healthcare. So that's the second challenge we're grappling with, is slower productivity growth. Even with the impressive advances in AI, they just aren't translating into the economy. The problem is that at the same time the pie is growing more slowly, the pie is also being distributed increasingly unequally. This shows the share of income going to the top 1% in the United States. For a long time it went down, but now it's going up, and it's roughly $1 in $5 for 1% of people, the highest that's been recorded. At the same time, the bottom 90% has seen its share fall steadily. Used to be that 2/3 of the pie went to the bottom 90% of workers. Now, a little bit more than half of the pie goes to the bottom 90% of workers. And it's not just the United States. You see the same thing in economies around the world, that same trend towards less for people in the middle and the bottom, at the same time that their incomes are growing more slowly. We could do an entire speech, we could even do an entire class on the causes of this. In part, it reflects developments in competitive markets. Skills are rewarded more because of technology. There's smaller increase in educated workers. Part, it reflects changes in labor market institutions that make it harder and reduce the bargaining power of workers. But whatever it is, it's a challenge. The next challenge, the fourth I want to talk about, is the future of work. Here, I think the popular perception may not be right. The popular perception is encapsulated in this article in CNN that said smart robots could soon steal your job. This article was written in 2016. It's very recent. That is the popular fear about the future of work. This is another article in the New York Times, a leading newspaper. It was in 1980. This author said, "A robot is after your job." Here's another article from 1960 in the Wall Street Journal. It said robots are taking jobs both in outer space and US factories. And here's an article now all the way back to 1935, Thinking Machines Replace the Thinker. So we have had a long-standing fear that robots were going to take our jobs. We've been worried about this for a very long time. In fact, I could go back hundreds of years. It wasn't robots then, it was machines. Well, how have these predictions panned out? The unemployment rate has been roughly the same for most of the last 100 years. And when the unemployment rate goes up, it's not because of robots, it's because of a recession. This prediction's been very off. There's many reasons this prediction has been off. One of those reasons is shown in this, that even as brick and mortar jobs went down, e-commerce jobs went up. Also, we've created more jobs in service industries, whether they're higher paid personal professional services or lower paid, like somebody working in a coffee store, because people are richer and can afford to do more of that. We also have created new types of jobs. We've also changed the nature of jobs. There are radiologist jobs are different in a world where they get assistance from machines than when they didn't. So the challenge for the future of work, I think, is less that the robots are going to take all our jobs, and more that the robots are going to compete with us and drive wages down for lower income workers and maybe drive them up at the top. So this really boils down, I think, again, to the same inequality problem we were worried about a moment ago. And this was a study that I did when I was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama. And we found that looking at a popular database of jobs that were at threat of automation, that if you looked at jobs that made less than $20 an hour, most of them were at threat of automation. If you look at jobs that make more than $40 an hour, very few of them were at threat from automation. And so the problem here isn't that the jobs will disappear, but that the wages in these jobs will go down. And maybe the wages in these jobs will go up, and it will exacerbate inequality. The next challenge I want to talk about is something that the next speaker or a speaker later on this morning, my friend Tomas Philippon, is going to be talking to you, I suspect, a lot about. And he's one of the leading researchers on this topic, which is declining competition. Start by showing you these two beers. Probably all have seen Budweiser, one of the most popular beers in America. Probably all seen Heineken. It's also one of the most popular beers in America. There's lots and lots of other beers, though. You can get Joe India Pale Ale, Goose India Pale Ale, Elysian Space Dust, Hop Knot IPA. You can also get Affligen, Maximus, Morte Cibite, Cibele. Sorry, I mispronounced all of these. The amazing thing is this tremendous variety of beers you can get in the store. All of these are made by Anheuser-Busch. All of these are made by the company Heineken. You see something similar in the market for mayonnaise, the market for cat food, the market for fertilizer, the market for washing machines, the cellular providers throughout the economy. And in fact, at the Council of Economic Advisors, we documented increased market concentration in a range of sectors. And a lot of other research has done this in a much, much more detailed way for hundreds and hundreds of sectors of the economy and linked it to all sorts of economic challenges, including the ones I was discussing of slower productivity growth and higher inequality. Now, there's good and bad reasons why companies might grow. Sometimes they grow because they're really technologically sophisticated and it helps the economy. Sometimes they grow because they're monopolists and they expand their monopoly power and no one is there to enforce the law and stop them. In the case of Google, Facebook, and Amazon, they've grown a little bit for both reasons. In part because they're super innovative, but also in part because of ways they've taken advantage of their dominant status. And how one responds to that going forward is a central challenge for policy. The last challenge I want to talk about is low interest rates. Now, if you're a business borrowing money, this isn't so much a challenge, this is an opportunity. But if you're a business borrowing money, it's also a symptom of how few great investment projects are out there. Interest rates have been falling across a wide range of countries for decades. This isn't something that was caused by the financial crisis or the COVID crisis. It isn't something that the central banks woke up one day and decided to do. This is a real structural change in our economy. And again, we could spend hours talking about what the structural change is, analyzing the structural change. But the important point is that it's here to last. The structural change has two really important implications. The first is there's now less scope for monetary policy. Monetary policy just can't do as much as it used to. But here's the good news. Fiscal policy needs to do more, and it can do more, both automatically in response to changes in the economy and also on a discretionary basis. In terms of monetary policy, in the United States, the Fed cut the Fed funds rate by about 6 percentage points in all the previous crises. In this crisis, it cut the Fed funds rate by 1.75 percentage points. It had very little room for monetary policy. So there's a lot less monetary policy can do. There's unconventional tools, quantitative easing, we could talk about that. But there's a limit to how much that can affect the economy, and it may bring some financial stability risks. There's a limit to what you can do on monetary policy. But the good news is fiscal policy has more space than it's ever had. We're all accustomed to seeing pictures of how much debt has risen. That's not the right way to think about it. You want to ask about what's happened to interest, because interest is lower. Debt is higher, but interest is lower. And as a result, interest payments have generally been trending down and are quite low. And so I'm not that worried about fiscal sustainability in a world of the low interest rates that we have now. So these are 6 challenges that we face. The COVID crisis is exacerbating all of them. Slower productivity growth, rising inequality, the future of work, declining competition, and lower interest rates. In many ways, these are interrelated. For businesses, they create a new set of challenges to deal with. In some cases, a new set of opportunities, lower cost of capital, and the like. But for all of us, unless we have a vigorous policy response to address them, they'll only grow and become more serious. I think the good news is we do have some tools to deal with them. We have fiscal space to respond to the COVID crisis, and many countries have deployed it. We can invest more in research, innovation, and infrastructure to help productivity growth. We can deal with inequality both by helping to raise wages and also ensure through the tax and transfer system that everyone benefits. We can help people with the future of work, especially by investing in education, the best way to future-proof your job. Making our economies increasingly competitive is an essential way of achieving all of those different goals and responding to all of those challenges. And insofar as we need to spend some more money to do that, with the low interest rates that we have today, businesses can afford to do that, and the government can afford to do that. The dialogue between businesses and the government is going to be a really important part of creating the conditions that all of us need for strong, sustained, shared economic growth. And I look forward to the continued discussion between Korea, the United States, and around the world about how to achieve those very important and shared goals that we all have. Thank you. So I now can take some of your questions.
이어서 포먼 교수님과의 질의응답 시간을 갖겠습니다. From now on, we'll have a Q&A session for 20 minutes with Professor Foreman. 질문 있으신 분은 손을 들어주시면 마이크를 전달해 드리겠습니다.
네, 질문 하나 드리고 싶습니다. 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 교수님 말씀 잘 들었습니다. 이게 부합한 주제인지는 저도 확신하지 않지만 한 가지 짚고 넘어가고 싶은 부분이요. 트럼프 대통령 등장 이후로 노골적으로 자국 우선주의가 나오면서 자유무역이라는 가치가 많이 훼손되고 있습니다. 그 가운데 이제 기업들의 노력을 정부의 재정으로 지원을 해준다면 이 자유 경쟁이라는 원칙이 왜곡될 우려가 있는데요. 이런 원칙을 훼손하지 않으면서도 기업과 정부가 이 코비드-19 위기를 극복할 수 있는 방안이 있을지, 또 이 포스트 코로나 시대에 이 자국 우선주의가 급속도로 확산되고 있는데요. 이 위기 극복 이후에 다시 자유무역이라는 가치로의 회귀가 가능할지 좀 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
Thank you for that question. It's such an important question. I'm a big believer that economic growth is positive sum. If the United States does well, other countries will benefit. If other countries do well, the United States will benefit. I think that's one of the most important insights of economics. Part of how that happens is through trade. Trade only happens if both sides want to do it. And thus both sides are made better off by it. I don't mind the language of America first. If it was genuinely about making America a better place, that would help Americans and it would help people around the world. What worries me is the policies that are pursued in the name of America first are not putting America first. In fact, they're hurting America. If you want to help America, you would let in more immigrants. You would let in more talented, innovative immigrants who are critical to productivity growth and innovation. You'd let in more workers to do jobs that are critical throughout our economy. If you wanted America to be first, you'd want our supply chains to be spread throughout the world. You'd want us to be exporting and importing from countries around the world. You'd want us to be engaged in a multilateral way to resolve our disputes. I think all of those are the way you would make America, maybe not first, but make America better and make other countries as well. And so I think the limits on immigration, the limits on trade are actually going to make America poor and hurt us and hurt our partners. When I look forward, I see, if President Trump is reelected, we'll continue that set of policies. If President Biden, if Vice President Biden wins the presidency, I think we'll see a change. Continue to see the United States being very tough on China. There's bipartisan concern about China and the United States. but you'd see it done more together with allies, more following global rules, more using global institutions to pursue what I think of as a number of different legitimate complaints with China. I think outside of China, you would see a much more cooperative United States. That's what I expect. I'm not an advisor to Biden and not speaking on his behalf, but that's what I would expect.
다른 질문 있으신 분 손 들어주세요.
예, 강연 잘 들었습니다. 한 가지 궁금한 것이 있는데요. 코로나 위기를 극복하기 위해서 각국이 이제 재정 정책을 적극적으로 써야 한다라고 이해를 했는데, 미국 같이 이제 기축통화 국가라면은 무제한적으로 뭐 돈을 찍어낼 수도 있다라고 생각을 하지만, 다른 정부 같은 경우에는 세수가 매우 한정이 있습니다. 그래서 이제 지원 대상을 우선순위를 가지고 선정을 해야 하는데, 교수님께서 생각하시는 그 지원 어떤 곳을 먼저 더 우선적으로 지원해야 이 위기를 극복할 수 있을지 의견을 듣고 싶습니다.
Right. So I think the most important priority is helping people so that they are less affected. And if you do a good job of helping people, that puts your overall economy in better shape. So giving money to workers who lost their jobs, giving just cash transfers to all households, that's been how we kept disposable personal income up. That's how consumption has made a V-shaped recovery, and that helps more businesses reopen and offer and create jobs. I think for businesses, the most important thing is stabilizing the overall financial market, which is something that central banks have done quite well, and then lending programs. Maybe the lending programs are on good terms, generous terms, so that you can afford to take out a loan. But the biggest issue with businesses is you want ones that have a liquidity problem to be able to get through it, but you don't want to permanently keep a business going if the business is no longer going to be a viable business. So I think grants to households, loans to businesses, and then the tougher thing is that's the policy response immediately in the wake of COVID. What do you do 1, 2, 3, 4 years later? If I'm right that the supply shock, the liquidity crisis, and the reallocation shock, if all of those, the supply, solvency, and reallocation, if all of those are continuing to be a challenge in the economy, how do you rebuild over a 5-year period of time, get your unemployment rate back, get businesses created? I don't have a great answer to that. I think certainly public investment can play a role. Education, training programs can play a role. And unfortunately, there may not actually be a full solution to how to rebuild the economy, but that's better than preventing the damage from happening in the first place.
I really appreciate Professor Foreman for making such a wonderful speech despite the time difference. Let's give him a big round of applause. Thank you, Professor Foreman. I hope to see you again in the future. Have a great night.
Okay, thank you so much. It was great joining you.
다음은 오늘 포럼의 첫 번째 강연으로 토마 필리폰 뉴욕대 재정학과 교수님을 연결하겠습니다. 필리폰 교수는 최근 자본주의의 경쟁 체제의 모순을 지적한 거대한 반전이라는 책으로 학회의 주목을 끈 소장파 경제학자입니다. 필리폰 교수님을 통해 코로나19 이후 자본주의의 미래에 대해 들어보겠습니다. I'd like to introduce Professor Pilafon from New York. How are you, Professor Pilafon?
Good morning. Everything is good here.
It's such a great honor to have you here today. I express warm and deep gratitude. Would you please give us a speech for 30 minutes from 9 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time? Let's welcome Professor Pilafon with a big round of applause.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I had the pleasure to listen to my friend Jason Furman just before, and it's not surprising, but we agree on many issues. And also his talk was a great survey of all the challenges that we are facing together. And I'm going to dive a bit more deeply into some of them. So my plan is to give the talk in two parts. So the first part is the world before COVID, and then the second part is going to be thinking about the risks and opportunities created by the COVID crisis. So I'm mostly going to spend time talking about the US and Europe because these are the places I know better. And I'll just mention topics that are definitely relevant for Asian economies. So before COVID, I think that we had already some issues in the world economy that played out sometimes in the same way in different countries, sometimes differently in different countries. So if you look at the US, what you see is rising concentration in inequality, which create challenges for the US economy, for US households, for US regulators. But on the other hand, the US was, remains, and will remain, as far as the eye can see, the leader in digital innovation. If I look at Europe, it's a little bit the opposite to some extent. I think Europe made great progress in market regulation. We went from very heavy state interventions in many markets to a much more free market within Europe. We also managed to contain inequality to a large extent. But we have challenges in terms of innovation, and in particular when it comes to AI and internet platforms. So in that sense, Europe and the US, although they are very similar in many respects, started from somewhat opposite sides of the issues. And Asia globally was, of course, the engine of growth for the world economy. Growth was fast. Growth was also relatively steady, actually. So there was not just that the Asian region was pulling the world economy; it was pulling it at a relatively steady pace. So it was a source of growth and a source of stability as well. But of course, most Asian countries, either directly or indirectly, are exposed to rising tensions between the US and China. So in my mind, these were three important features of the world before COVID. So in the second half of the talk, I'm going to think about how COVID might change these issues. If you go from the issue of concentration first, the mechanical effect of COVID is going to be very bad. It's clearly going to lead to more concentration of corporate power. There is much we can do to avoid a very bad outcome, but clearly the natural tendency will be to reinforce some of the trends we saw earlier. In terms of trade, the big danger post-COVID is going to be a return of nationalism and protectionism. And then the big question mark going forward, in my mind at least, or one of the big question marks, is whether we're finally going to get more out of the digital economy than we're getting so far. That's true for productivity. It might also be true for trade. So we'll think a little bit about that. So let's start by taking stock of what was happening before COVID. So much of what I'm going to show now is based on the book I published with Harvard last year. So I'm going to look at the US and then I'm going to look at Europe. So let's start with the US. So this is a picture which is very similar to actually some of the work that Jason Furman did when he was at the CEA under President Obama. Here we simply look at concentration in US industries. So I plotted here the average change in concentration within the manufacturing sector and within the non-manufacturing sector. So within manufacturing, you take, fairly granular number of industries, maybe like 100 or something like that. And then for each of them, you just look at the top 8 firms and you look at the market share of the top 8 firms. And this plots the average increase or the average difference over time in the market share of the top 8 firms. So what you see is that both in manufacturing and in non-manufacturing, the top 8 firms have gained market share. In the case of, say, non-manufacturing, it's about 8 percentage points from starting from a baseline of something like 0.2, 0.3. So, went up by about a quarter. So if you want to keep a number in mind, you can think that if you had a typical industry where you have 5 large firms playing in that industry 20 years ago, then on average, today you would have only 4 firms remaining. Okay, so roughly speaking, that's what happened on average across most industries in the US, from like something like 5 down to 4 big firms. Now, of course, it's not true in every industry. There's lots of heterogeneity, but that's give you a sense. So it's not like the end of competition in all industries, but it's a very significant change. Now, the reason that this is an interesting and complicated topic, of course, is that there is no simple way to think of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Concentration itself could be good or bad. So to illustrate, I'm going to tell you a good concentration story and illustrate with Walmart, and then I'll tell you a bad one, and I'm going to illustrate with the US telecom industry. So good concentration, when does that happen? Well, pretty mechanically, if you think about concentration, it could just be that you have one big firm dominating, already like the market leader. And that firm happened to innovate even faster than everybody else. So it was already number 1, and it's just going to pull ahead even further. So the market share of the leader is going to expand because the leader is just getting better. So that's going to look like increasing concentration. But of course, the only reason it's happening is because the leader is just delivering higher productivity growth, better product, or lower prices, and typically all of them together. So that's good news, all right? So typically when you see these good concentration dynamics, you see lower prices, higher productivity. In recent years, it's almost always linked to high intangible investment. And we've seen that happening in many industries. Retail and wholesale trade are a good example. And on the right, you see the expansion of Walmart in the US. So Walmart back in the 70s was essentially, it was very small. So the market share is measured on the right. It was essentially 0. Sorry. It went up to 60%, right? From 0 to 60%. That's a huge increase in market share. It's an amazing expansion. But the thing that's striking here in green, I plot the profit margin. What's very striking is that the profit margin of Walmart during that expansion was flat, if anything, slightly falling. What that means, if you think about it, it means that every 1% increase in productivity that Walmart achieved was passed on as a 1% decline in prices for consumers. Now, of course, this is not to say that Walmart's expansion was not disruptive. It was highly disruptive. They put a lot of other business out of business. They led to bankruptcy. You might argue that their labor practices were not great. All of that is fair game. But at the very least, you have to admit that they led to really good outcomes for consumers. And as economists, that's a very important part of what we do. And I think that's why we call that good concentration. Now, bad concentration is when you don't see any of this. So you still see dominant firms becoming more dominant, but instead of having low prices and high productivity, you have high prices and low productivity and high profit margins. So this is typically what we see in the telecom, airlines, and healthcare industry in the US. And just as an illustration, let's look at the telecom industry. So here you have the markup in green and the concentration in red. So you see the markup going up by something like 30 or 40%. That's a huge increase in markups. And at the same time, of course, as concentration is going up by about 20 or 30%. So a huge increase in markup, a huge increase in concentration. Now, I'm sure many of you have traveled to the US. It is not the case that telecom quality for household is higher in the US. It's just higher prices. And just to drive the point home, this is a really simple comparison. This is just asking the question, how much do households pay on average to get fast internet services at home, right? So the cost of broadband, the monthly cost, so each month, the cost of getting a broadband connection into your home. And every advanced economy in the world is in the range of $30 to $40 per month. Okay, so I just, this is a slide from my book. So you see France, South Korea, Germany, and pretty much the UK would be in the same ballpark. Everybody is in that range. The US is twice more expensive as anybody else. Okay? So US consumers are paying a very high price because they don't have a choice for their broadband connections, and they are getting ripped off by their internet providers. That's pretty much as simple as that. Now, what is more interesting is that it used to be the opposite. And my book is called The Great Reversal, precisely because of that reason. I came to the US 20 years ago when France was expensive and the US was cheap. It was much cheaper to get an internet connection in the US 20 years ago than in France 20 years ago. And today it's reversed, okay? So clearly something drastic has changed in the US, at least for that industry over the past 20 years. Similarly, things have changed in Europe, but in the right direction, okay? So in Europe, we started from an economy where the markets were not very free. There were many restrictions to entry and operations. It was very hard for businesses to start. And then in the 1990s, we created a single market, of course, as you know. And at the same time, we looked around, and in particular, we looked up to the US for a model of how you regulate an economy correctly. And the US at the time was, of course, pushing very hard the idea of free markets. And so Europeans were in large part influenced by these ideas, not just the Europeans, but the Europeans in particular. And as you can see, between the mid-90s and mid-2000s, Europe went through a very large number of product market reforms, essentially on average, one major reform per country per year. And these reforms aimed at removing barriers to competition. So for instance, this is how France became cheaper than the US in terms of telecom services. So this is simply the relative price of communication services in France relative to the US. This is data from the World Bank and the International Comparison of Prices. So France used to be 15% more expensive than the US. And then something happened in 2011. And then 2 years later, France was almost 30% cheaper, and now France is 50% cheaper. So what happened in 2011? Well, clearly it was not a drastic change in technology, because by and large, we use the same headset. I mean, we use the same Androids or the same iPhones. But the technology for connection is also quite similar. What changed is competition. France used to have 3 internet providers, and it was a classic oligopoly charging high prices. And then there was an entrant who wanted to come and compete with the incumbents, but essentially under pretty heavy lobbying by existing oligopolies, the new entrant didn't get a license until 2011, when finally Free Mobile got a license, entered the market, cut prices by half. Right, so not like 10%, 20%, half. They entered at half the price of the incumbents and forced all the prices downwards. And that's how France became one of the best countries in the world to get a cell phone or an internet connection in your home. So that, I think, is at least one view of what was going on before COVID. The US had experienced 20 years of rising concentration markups and corporate profits. That was especially true in transport, telecom, and energy and healthcare, where if you compare what people pay here in the US to pretty much every advanced economy in the world, you find that US consumers pay higher prices. On the other hand, of course, US was also the home of many of the leading internet firms, extremely successful and innovative. Europe was kind of the other way, right? So for 20 years, we actually improved competition in many sectors. So people can move around. The airlines are cheaper. Everything is cheaper in terms of transportation. Telecom, amazingly cheaper. Energy sector, retail, all of that was actually becoming more consumer friendly. But Europe was lagging in the internet sector. Okay, then came COVID. So the question is, what is COVID going to do to all of these trends? So let's start with concentration. Well, obviously, as soon as COVID started, the government realized that the first potential victims of COVID would be small firms. Okay, so if you look around the world at essentially all of the programs that were put in place to protect firms against the COVID crisis, they all included very large programs in favor of small and medium-sized enterprises. So credit facilities, lending program for small firms, all of them in the UK, Germany, France, and in Korea, as we heard earlier this morning, and also in the US. So governments were on top of that in terms of awareness, at least. The big unknown is whether that's going to be enough or not. And that's where we don't know yet, but I think there is one important feature that we already see coming, which is that we're going to have very, very unequal outcomes across firms. There were two studies that were published this morning, actually, in the US, looking at how small firms are coping with COVID. And it turns out that, but of course, as we expect, it's on average, it's a negative shock. So on average, it's bad for business. But the most striking fact in the data is not so much that it's bad on average, it's that it's amazingly dispersed. And if you go to one extreme, you look at venture capital-backed firms. Okay, so it's a very small subset, very specific sample, typically of high-tech firms that are almost all digital from the get-go. These firms are actually doing pretty well. In fact, if you ask venture capitalists about their portfolio companies, they say that more than half of their investments are, either positively affected or unaffected by the pandemic. Now, positively affected, that might sound surprising, but it's not, because many of them are digital service companies, and in fact, their demand for their services has gone up. So they are doing extremely well. And for them, working from home is not a problem. And among these VC-backed firms, only 10% were severely negatively affected. Okay, so it doesn't look too bad. On the other hand, we had another really good paper that used a huge survey in the late spring using Facebook data. So you could reach a huge number of small companies, including companies that were going out of business. So it's not a fully representative cross-section of US businesses, but it's actually close to what you would get from census data. And there, the picture is very different. The picture in the big survey is that more than 60% of businesses lost, had a negative shock to their demand. And on average, for these 60% who had a negative shock, the shock was huge. They lost half of their business. They're all struggling to pay bills, rents, wages. If they have already outstanding debts, they're also struggling to pay back their debt. Many of them don't have access to a credit line, so they have to rely on personal savings to go through. When the survey was conducted, only slightly more than half expected to be able to survive another 6 months of lockdown. Okay, which is why if the lockdown comes back, it's going to be a bloodbath for SMEs. Okay, so that's, I think, is a very important impact of COVID. It's going to create a very large inequality in performance between firms that can quickly adapt to the digital economy and firms, perhaps because of their business model, who simply cannot do it as quickly. What about the other So I was talking about small firms. Now let's go all the way to the other side, the huge firms. What happened to them? Something interesting as well is happening there. So that's a market where the common wisdom was completely wrong, as I show in my book. But it turns out that things are changing in an interesting way. So if you read the press, and I'm talking about pre-COVID now, you got the feeling that really Amazon and Google and Facebook were totally unprecedented companies. Like the fact that they were so big and profitable is something we had never seen before. And that was just completely wrong. It was just utterly complete nonsense. If you look at the history of the United States, at any point in time, you have very dominant firms who are doing extremely well almost all the time because they are very good companies, very innovative. And they are always very big because of that. And they're always very rich and profitable. And on top of it, quantitatively, they look very similar like the Amazon and Facebook, Googles of today. So formally, here you see on this graph is the market share, the equity market share of the top 5 firms, right? So take the whole stock market in the US, take the top 5 firms by market value, and ask how much of the total value of the stock market is just in these 5 firms. And the answer is 10%. And it's been 10% for 40 years, okay? Up to February this year. Okay, so from like the 1970s until early 2020 or late 2019, roughly speaking, the top 5 firms were 10% of the market. And then COVID happens, and now it's close to 20%. Now there's been as you've seen in the press, there's been a bit of a market correction recently, so maybe now it's not 20, maybe it's 18 or 17. It's still huge. Okay, so that's a very significant change. So now it is true for the first time in post-war period that we have 5 firms who really dominate the market in a way which we haven't seen at least in, say, 40 or 50 years. So that's a new phenomenon, and that's totally driven by COVID. Okay, so I think my takeaway from that is that the issue of COVID is going to create extremely large inequality among businesses. Which brings us to the digital economy. So now, whether you're going to be pessimistic about that or not depends a lot on your view on the digital economy. And as Jason Furman explained earlier, that's where we economists are very puzzled. In fact, I think that's the most interesting and puzzling debate in economics today, certainly the most important one, which is we simply don't understand why productivity growth is so slow. Right? So if you read the press, if you go to travel to California, Boston, or even New York, actually, you hear everywhere stories about innovation being amazingly fast, about artificial intelligence, new startups, and VCs being very excited by all these new ideas. And you say, great. And then you go back home, you look at the numbers, and like, okay, but why is the economy not growing then? Like, we don't see productivity growth. Okay, so there's this gap between the perception of innovation being quick and amazingly vibrant, and the data that just doesn't bear this idea. We don't see high productivity growth. And of course, that's the main point that was made in a great book by Bob Gordon. We still don't know what the true answer is. Essentially, people who are optimistic about technology argue that, wait, you haven't seen it yet. Just wait. Okay, so they say all of these AI inventions, it's just going to take time for them to materialize into high productivity growth. So just be patient. And Bob Gordon is saying, no, I don't think so. I don't think so because none of these ideas are going to be as important as electricity or the combustion engine, or even like washing machines or air conditioning. So my view is, of course, we don't know, but I think it's fair to say that we are going to know faster than we thought, because COVID is making the transition to the digital economy much, much faster. Okay, and many businesses that did not fully embrace the digital model, now they don't have a choice. So we're going to see. And so my view is that if within the next 2 years, that is 2022, 2023, if within these 2 years we don't see a significant pickup in productivity growth, then I think it will show that Bob Gordon was right. If we do see productivity growth, then we're all going to be very happy. So let me conclude with the main risks then. I think we've seen where we started from. We've seen the main challenges created by COVID. So what are the risks going forward? Just going to try to explain the risk regions by regions. Let's start with Europe. In Europe, I think that the danger is that we're going to abandon the policies that were quite successful in the past 20 years at improving both, competition and also consumer welfare. So there is always a danger of coming back to policies that favor national champions, closing the borders, and I think that would be a real pity. And these risks are going to be amplified by the fear of being left out of the internet platform game, essentially squeezed between the two dominant players in China and the US. So that, I think, is the main issue. I think there is a solution to that, which is to have a clear separation between trade policy and competition policy. And it's okay to be a bit more aggressive on the trade side, but keeping the free market at home. Whether that's going to be the outcome in Europe or not, nobody knows. In the US, the risks are pretty, there are many risks at many levels, but the ones that matter most for the world economy in the short term are going to be a bit like in Europe, a return to protectionism and the abandonment of the free trade ideal. But of course, with the added issue that the US used to be the champion of these values, and then without the US as a champion, these values are going to have a hard time persisting, surviving. And this is going to happen in the context of escalating tensions with China. And there, as I'm sure you're all aware, I just want to reemphasize the point Jason Furman made earlier. This has become a bipartisan issue. In fact, there are very few bipartisan issues in the US now. Republicans and Democrats essentially agree on nothing. But that's one of the few things they agree on today, which is that the policy toward China needs to be more assertive. So irrespective of who wins, the tension with China are likely to remain. Now, they would play out differently under two different administrations, but the underlying tension is unlikely to disappear. What are the hopes? Well, I think the hopes in this global economy is also a little bit linked to the hopes I highlighted for productivity growth. For productivity growth, we are really hoping for digital services or for the digital economy in general to deliver finally. If you think about trade, the question is, can we have a meaningful increase in trade in services, right? If you look at the consumption pattern of households in rich countries, goods have become only 20% perhaps of what people buy. Okay, so most of what we buy are not like physical goods. So, if trade is really focused on physical goods, there's just so much it's going to be able to do, right? Because that's not what we care about the most today. We have enough, many people in rich countries have enough material goods, and they care about other types of goods and services. But these services are harder to trade across borders. Now, that was very true pre-COVID. The question is whether that's still going to be true post-COVID. And that's a question mark, because many things we thought would not happen within the next 5 or 10 years happened within the last 6 months because we had to. They might, I think many businesses that thought it would be difficult to operate without physical contact discovered that it's perfectly fine. There's tons of stuff you can do online directly without ever meeting physically. And so whether that's going to translate to remote medicine, the provision of personal services tailored to individuals directly over the internet, media and entertainment, is there going to be a broad Zoom effect in trade? It's an open question, but that's one of the hope for the future. So to conclude with just this chart from Korea, just to reiterate what Jason said earlier, the amazing performance of the Korean economy. This is compared to here the US and Europe. You can see on this graph the fast and steady growth in Korea, and the fact that at least over the first two semester of the COVID crisis, Korea has been doing extremely well, both in terms of containing the virus, and then in part thanks to its efficient healthcare response in having a much smaller recession than most other rich countries. So that's, I think, is the good news. The risk, of course, is that Korea is an open economy, very much plugged into the world economy, and so it's sensitive to global tensions, which means that it has a vested interest in making sure that some of the risks I highlighted in the previous slide do not materialize. And I hope and expect that Korea will remain one of the leading nations driving the economy towards trade and peace as opposed to global tensions. Thank you very much.
Professor Philippon, thank you so much for giving us such a great speech. Please put your hands together for Professor Philippon.